Welcome to Handmade Happenings. I'm Marissa, and today I'm talking about a stash busting project. So recently I made myself a dress and I had a pretty good amount of fabric left over. In fact, more than I would keep for say like a doll project, but just enough to make a dress for one of my nieces. And as it happens, I do have one niece who really likes purple. For this project, I decided to go with more of a play outfit and opted to go for a top and shorts set instead of a dress. And I chose to use for the top the Peony Patterns Poppy pattern, and it has like the dress views and then it has a view that's just a top. And so I'm going with that view of that without the ruffles, and then for the shorts pattern I decided to go with the Peekaboo Pattern Shop Classic Chinos pattern, which also has like the long pants view and the shorts view, so I'm using the shorts view. So the first thing I had to do was make sure that all of the pattern pieces were going to fit on the fabric, because despite the fact that this was both for a child and using a short set pattern, the pieces were pretty big. I often forget that as my nieces and nephews are getting older, everything just takes more fabric. But fortunately it did all fit, and so I set out cutting all of the pieces that were needed. For the top it did have some lining pieces, and for the shorts it was just, cut two of everything. And the only thing that I did not cut out was the center front of the bodice. And for that, instead, I just cut a rectangle that was big enough to fit the pattern piece and then traced the shape of the pattern onto the fabric using a heat erase pen. So I did that because I wanted to embroider a design on the center front of the fabric, and it's just easier to get the fabric into an embroidery hoop if it's a rectangle and not already cut out. Now, the niece that this is getting this outfit, in addition to liking purple, also likes Minnie Mouse, and she's getting kind of towards that age where there's not a lot of clothes in the store that are going to have Minnie Mouse on them. So I decided to embroider like the Minnie Mouse head, I guess you could call it, onto the front of this and add a bow. To create this pattern template for it, I took a round object and just traced it onto a piece of paper, and then took a smaller round item and traced it for the ear, and then folded it in half to cut it out so that they were, it was the same on both sides and not like uneven. I then traced this onto the center of the front bodice piece that I had traced out on that rectangle earlier. And then I put a straight line down the middle of that tracing. I did this because the stitch that I chose for this pattern was the satin stitch, and I will say I don't do the satin stitch much. In fact, I chose it in part because I needed the practice. But I drew that center line to hopefully help my lines stay even and straight up and down, and not going at some really funky angle. And it does seem like it worked, because when I was finished, I have to say it was probably the best project I've done in the satin stitch, which isn't saying much because, again, I don't do it often. But it was a simple shape, so thankfully it turned out. After that was done, I set about making the bow. So for that, I just took a small rectangle of lighter purple fabric and stitched around majority of it before flipping it right sides out, and gathered it up in the center, which also closed the hole that I left for toning. and then stitched it onto the front of the shirt using purple embroidery floss. So what I did was I used it and stitched a couple of stitches to attach it to the shirt, and then I did several like almost satin stitches or passes just over the center of the bow to create that look like you would have if you were to make one and like make a separate piece to wrap around the middle of the bow. So with the fun part of the top finished, it's time to move on to the construction. So this particular pattern is constructed a bit differently than normal. It is actually a pinafore style dress, and it's pretty difficult to explain what's going on. I'm going to do my best. This is not a tutorial, so I'm not going to stress about it too much, and hopefully the visuals will help. So the first step of assembling is probably about the same as anything else, which is sewing the shoulder seams. And in this case, it's the center front bodice, and then it just has like straps that are sewn at the shoulder seams. And this is for both the main fabric and the lining fabric, which in my case is just more of the main fabric, but without the embroidery on the front. Then the pattern has two back pieces, which are kind of triangle shaped, and the main fabric is placed right sides together with the lining and stitched along part of the top, but not all of the top. It's the stitching stops right before the straps are, because that needs to be left open to have the straps added. Then the back pieces are placed onto the right side of the main center front piece and pinned into place near the bottom. And then the lining layer is layered on top of that so that the back piece is sandwiched in between, and pinned and sewn along the two side seams as well as around the neckline. Curves are clipped, and then everything is flipped right side out. At this point, it is beginning to actually look like a top. It's beginning to look a little more familiar. And so then once everything is back to right sides out, I took the straps and pinned them to the right side of the back piece. This is why that gap was left. Then I took the lining piece and kind of flipped it over so that the right sides were together of the back pieces, and finished stitching along that upper seam as well as down that back seam, and flipped it all back to right sides out. And with that, the top of this, well, shirt is done. Next comes the skirt for this top. So to assemble the skirt was fairly simple. I stitched the side seams, folded over the back, and stitched down about an inch or two, and then gathered it, attached it to the top of the shirt, and then sewed up the center back seam and pressed and hemmed the bottom. And the last thing was the buttons and buttonholes. I did the buttonholes on my sewing machine, and then I just stitched the buttons on by hand. So that was the top. Now it's on to the shorts. Now the pattern that I'm using it has this extension in the front because it's done to have like a faux zipper and button in the front. I just wanted like a flat front waistband, so I did make a few modifications. For assembly, I started out by stitching the back darts, which are at the waist on the back pattern pieces. I then stitched the front two pieces together at the crotch seam, and then attached the back pieces at the side seam. At this point, I went ahead and serged all of those seams, as well as the hem of the shorts and the long edge of the waistband. I then folded the waistband in half and pressed it before attaching it to the pants at the waist, but only along the one edge that was not serged. I then stitched up the back crotch, starting at the waistband and all the way down. After serging that, I then stitched the inseam of the shorts and hemmed the bottom of the leg opening. And then it was time to mess with the waistband. So this is an elastic backed pair of shorts, so that meant folding over the waistband and stitching the back from one side seam to the other, but only the back of the waistband. I then cut the elastic to the size stated on the pattern and threaded it through, pinning it at that side seam, and then pulling it to the other side seam and pinning it there. Then it was back to the sewing machine. I started at one end of the elastic and stitched up and down over it. I usually do it 3 or 4 times, going back and forth to make sure that the elastic is secured, making sure that I'm really catching it. And then I stitched down the front of the waistband all the way around to that other side seam, where I then went back and forth over the other end of the elastic. And then all that was left to do was turn the shorts right side out, and I have a cute little play set for my niece.